Welcome back to Yɛresiesie, the Preparation for Reparations podcast. I'm your host, Esther Xosei from the Maangamizi Educational Trust. This is the second part of our examination of Movement Capture and Counterinsurgency, protecting our reparations work. In part 1, we explored how reparations movements face sophisticated efforts to neutralize their transformative potential. We examined movement capture, the process by which demands for fundamental change are redirected, diluted, or contained. We discussed counterinsurgency tactics used against reparations advocates, the politics of respectability that pressure us to moderate our demands, and the emerging reparations industrial complex that adopts our language while emptying it of radical content. We also explored the crucial distinction between descriptive and substantive African representation, noting that the mere presence of people who look like us in positions of authority does not guarantee authentic representation of our interests and perspectives. Today, we focus on practical strategies for protecting our movements from these forms of capture. We'll explore African-centered principles that can serve as anchors for our work, examine case studies of successful resistance to co-optation, discuss approaches to building independent infrastructure, and provide concrete tools for ensuring our reparations demands maintain their transformative potential. Before we begin, let us pour libation to honour our ancestresses and ancestors and set our intentions. We pour libation to the Creator, the source of all life, wisdom and discernment, to Mother Earth who sustains our struggles, to the ancestors and ancestresses who faced and overcame attempts to silence their resistance, whose vigilance protects our movements, whose clarity guides our vision, whose wisdom helps us distinguish allies from adversaries. May our words honour their sacrifices, and may our works advance our struggle. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo. African-centered principles for reparations work. In protecting our movements from capture and co-optation, we must anchor our work in African-centered principles and values that recognize the ancestral covenant binding us to continue the liberation work of those who came before us. These principles include Maat, the ancient Kemetic principle of truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, and reciprocity must guide our reparations work. Following Professor Molena Karenga's ethical framework, we recognize reparations as sarujta, the moral obligation to repair and heal the world by raising up what is in ruins, repairing what is damaged, rejoining what is severed, replenishing what is depleted, strengthening what is weakened, setting right what is wrong, and making flourish what is underdeveloped. Ubuntu, a profound philosophical concept that transcends the simplistic translation of I am because we are. Ubuntu represents a comprehensive worldview of human and natural world interdependence, mutual care, and collective dignity. It challenges Western individualistic paradigms by overstanding human existence as fundamentally relational and communal with all living beings. In the context of reparations, Ubuntu demands a holistic approach to repair that goes beyond individual compensatory measures. It requires us to recognize that harms to one is a harm to us all, and healing must be collective, systemic, and deeply transformative. Ancestral accountability. Our work is a continuous dialogue across time, a responsibility that extends beyond individual lifetimes. We acknowledge our responsibility to those who came before us and those yet unborn. We are bound by a sacred covenant to those who came before and those yet unborn. When representatives negotiate inadequate or symbolic reparations alone, they commit ancestral treason, betraying both past and present struggles and future generations' needs. Self-determination. True reparatory justice requires that African people determine the nature, scope, and implementation of repair. This means rejecting efforts by perpetrators or elites to define what constitutes adequate reparations or to impose solutions without meaningful community participation. Our sovereignty is not negotiable, and our right to determine the nature, scope, and implementation of repair is absolute. Ujamaa. Beyond cooperative economics, this principle demands a radical reimagining of economic relations. Reparations are not just about individual access or progress within exploitative systems that are racially capitalist, but about building collective wealth, economic sovereignty, and transformative economic models that dismantle the very structures of oppression. Reparations that merely provide access to capitalist institutions without transforming economic relations cannot address the root causes of the continuing exploitative impacts of the Maangamizi. So these principles of Maat, Ubuntu, ancestral accountability, self-determination, and Ujamaa provide clear criteria for evaluating proposed reparations measures and for identifying co-optation attempts. When governments, institutions, or even purported representatives advance solutions that violate these principles, we must recognize and resist such efforts as movement capture. So what does successful movement protection look like? While we've examined mechanisms of movement capture and co-optation, it's equally important to learn from successful resistance. Effective reparations movements protect their integrity through strategic approaches that prioritize community sovereignty and comprehensive transformation. By developing independent economic infrastructures such as community-controlled agricultural projects, housing cooperatives, and local businesses, these movements create material foundations for their political work. They invest heavily in political education, ensuring members understand the critical distinction between superficial access and genuine sovereignty. Crucially, they practice collective leadership with clear accountability structures, preventing any single individual from representing the movement without a direct mandate from community assemblies, for example. This approach allows movements to strategically engage with institutional processes while maintaining their radical vision, resisting attempts to narrow their demands or accept inadequate compromises. For example, the Ovaherero and Nama resistance, despite the German and Namibian government's attempts to exclude them for reparations negotiations for the 1904 to 1908 genocide, affected Ovaherero and Nama communities have maintained powerful resistance. Their strategies include refusing recognition of any agreement made without their direct participation, filing legal actions in both international and domestic courts, and processes to challenge the legitimacy of the state-to-state agreement that excludes them. They've built international solidarity networks, connecting with other reparations movements globally to strengthen their position and increase pressure on both governments, that is, the government of Germany and Namibia, and they've maintained their own community-led truth and documentation processes, ensuring that their historical narrative cannot be erased or distorted in official accounts. Similarly, PARCOE, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, has consistently maintained a radical vision of reparations while engaging with institutions. Their protection strategies include that we must ground our work in the principle of reparations as a process, not just payment, preventing the reduction of reparations to financial transactions between elites. They also practice intergenerational leadership, ensuring both elders with historical knowledge and younger generations with new approaches share decision-making power. They've maintained strict independence from political parties and European governments' funding sources that might dilute their demands. And of course, working through and connected to the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, they have helped to influence the development of participatory approaches to reparations, such as the institutionalization of Pan-African Reparations Rebellion groundings, Pan-African People's Assemblies on African reparations, and administrative reparations processes and mechanisms such as demands for all-party parliamentary commissions of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice, and the Ubuntu Gotla People's International Tribunal for Global Justice. From these examples, we can extract several key protection practices: developing independent economic infrastructure, investing in deep political education, practicing collective and accountable leadership, clearly articulating comprehensive frameworks, building broad-based membership structures, engaging strategically with institutional processes and critically at the same time, while maintaining independent organizing, building international solidarity networks, conducting community-led documentation processes, and centering intergenerational as well as leadership from amongst our indigenous African communities, more specifically, and African heritage communities more generally. Now, these practices don't guarantee protection from co-optation, but they significantly strengthen movements' resilience against capture efforts. Building independent infrastructure. Central to protecting our movements is building independent infrastructure. Organizational structures, resourcing mechanisms, communication platforms, and knowledge systems that don't rely on institutional approval or resources that come with compromising conditions. This infrastructure development has several dimensions. Economic independence requires moving beyond seeking funding and grant dependency towards self-generated resources and securing restitution of all our looted resources. This includes membership dues, cooperative enterprises, the development of community land trusts and resource sharing networks. As our ancestors and ancestresses understood, economic independence is fundamental to political autonomy. Communications independence means developing our own media platforms and networks rather than relying solely on mainstream channels to transmit our messages. When we control our own narrative infrastructure, we prevent the distortion or selective representation of our demands. So the Uhuru movement's development of Black Power radio station and Burning Spear newspaper demonstrates how independent media allows movements to communicate directly with communities, circumventing gatekeepers who might dilute our message. Also, we have the example of the Amandla newspaper, Belize's largest and most long-standing newspaper, established in 1969, and XTV, formerly known as Creme TV. Similarly, community radio initiatives in various African heritage communities and countries provide models for communications independence. Knowledge and analysis independence involves building our own research capacities, documentation processes, and theoretical frameworks rather than relying on academic institutions or think tanks to define our reality. This ensures that our analytical frameworks center African experiences, perspectives, and epistemologies, knowledge systems. Professor Marimba Ani's development of Afrocentric theoretical frameworks like the SEALI provides tools for analysing European cultural systems from an African-centered perspective. Similarly, through the work of the INASAR, the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, which is creating innovative approaches to African reparations, there is a unification of the efforts of scholars and scholar activists and community activists in a combined quest to contribute positively to advancing the cause of African reparations. In INASAR, there is a commitment to a non-extractive process of ethical scholarship and knowledge exchange that recognizes the existence of a grassroots international social movement for African reparations, or ISMA, to which many establishment scholars recognize they are accountable. INASAR also strives to counter asymmetrical power relations at work when establishment academics operating within elite institutions engage with reparations. They've called upon academics to acknowledge these power imbalances and pay attention to the tendency of professionalized experts or university-based intellectuals to ignore, render invisible, or overwrite the voices, ideas, and indeed theories produced by those engaged in social struggles from the ground up. Organisational independence requires building structures that reflect our values and priorities rather than adopting models designed for other purposes. This might include circular rather than hierarchical forms of leadership, consensus-based decision-making, and transparent accountability mechanism. The Maat Zoazajuras, the Maat Action Learning Circles, exemplify organisational independence through their community-based structures that integrates political education, cultural practice, and organising work. Similarly, the Stop the Mangamizi campaign's assembly structures, Pan-African People's Assemblies that is, ensures broad participation in decision-making. Building this infrastructure is not about complete isolation. Strategic engagement, critical engagement that is, with existing institutions remains important. It's about ensuring that such engagement occurs from a position of strength with our own independent base from which to organise and negotiate. Practical tools for protecting reparations movements. While building independent infrastructure provides a foundation for movement protection, we also need practical tools and practices for daily organising work. These tools help us identify capture attempts early and respond effectively before our movements are compromised. So, community accountability processes ensure that representatives remain accountable to those they represent rather than to external institutions. This includes regular report backs to communities on engagements with institutions or government bodies, mandated positions determined through community assemblies rather than individual discretion, recall procedures for representatives who deviate from community mandates, rotation of representation roles to prevent the emergence of a permanent class of people who are always doing the speaking. Intentional language and framing protect our movements from semantic capture, the co-optation of our terminology while emptying it of radical content. This includes developing clear glossaries that define key terms from our perspective, challenging the misuse of concepts like reconciliation or even healing when deployed to bypass material forms of repair, consistently articulating the full scope of reparations rather than allowing its reduction to a single dimension. How about strategic non-cooperation? Strategic non-cooperation with processes designed to contain or redirect our demand preserves movement integrity. This includes refusing participation in advisory roles that lack decision-making power, withdrawing from processes that exclude community representation, publicly naming and challenging performative or symbolic gestures presented as meaningful repair, and refusing to participate in superficial dialogue processes that exclude discussions of concrete measures and programs and initiatives of repair. Collective study and political education build shared analysis that enables communities to recognise co-optation. This includes regular study circles examining historical examples of movement capture and assessing them and being able to recognise contemporary parallels. Intergenerational dialogues connecting historic and contemporary struggles for reparations, critical analysis of current reparations proposals against comprehensive reparations frameworks, such as the Chimwezu conceptual framework and the UN or United Nations operational framework on reparations. Transparency practices prevent the development of hidden agendas or unaccountable negotiations. This includes public documentation of all meetings with institutions, open source records of decision-making processes, accessible archives of movement demands and positions. Movement-centered conflict resolution addresses internal disagreements before they can be exploited to divide our efforts. This may include restorative justice processes for addressing harm within movements, principled frameworks for navigating strategic disagreements or ideological disagreements or any other disagreements that come up, elders' councils that can mediate conflicts with spiritual and cultural grounding. The Ubuntu principles employed by various Pan-African formations provide guidance for these processes. These practical tools must be customized to specific context and combined with the infrastructure development discussed earlier. Together, they form a comprehensive protection strategy that allows our movements to engage with powerful institutions while maintaining our integrity and transformative vision of our people. The role of international law and solidarity. International legal frameworks and transnational solidarity networks offer additional protection for reparations movements. While international law does have its limitations, strategic engagement with these frameworks can strengthen our position and provide leverage against co-optation attempts. Key international legal instruments that support reparations claims making include the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to a Remedy and Reparation, the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the various genocide conventions and protocols against crimes against humanity. These frameworks establish legal principles that can be mobilized to challenge inadequate or symbolic reparations proposals. For example, the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to a Remedy and Reparations establish that reparations must include 5 elements: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. When governments or institutions attempt to reduce reparations to a single element, typically a very limited type of compensation, we can invoke these internationally recognized principles. International solidarity networks also provide crucial protection by creating accountability through external observation and documentation, amplifying our demands beyond national borders, connecting movements facing similar capture attempts, and providing alternative resources that reduce dependency on compromised and controlled funding. The International People's Tribunal on U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico shows how international legal frameworks can be adapted for community-led justice processes that operate outside state control while drawing on international legal principles. Similarly, the Stop the Angamising campaign demands to establish the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparative Justice and People's International Tribunal for Global Justice, the Ubuntu Gotla, provides another model of how it is envisioned that international structures can strengthen local reparations work, or should we say global reparations work, without imposing external agendas. However, we must approach international engagement strategically, recognizing that international institutions themselves can become sites of movement capture. This requires maintaining leadership by directly affected communities rather than professional NGOs outside of such communities. Ensuring that international advocacy amplifies rather than replaces local or global organizing, developing collective positions before engaging international forums to prevent dividing our movements, and critically examining how international legal frameworks may themselves reflect coloniality. When balanced with strong community-based organising, international legal strategies and solidarity networks become powerful tools for protecting our movements from local capture attempts. The politics of representation and betrayal. As we've discussed in previous episodes, the politics of representation presents particular challenges for reparations movements. While substantive representation by African-centered advocates is essential, we must also develop frameworks for addressing betrayal when those purporting to represent our interests instead facilitate movement capture. Historical examples of betrayal in liberation struggles provide important lessons. During post-independence transitions across Africa, many leaders who had fought for liberation subsequently negotiated compromises that preserved colonial economic structures and power structures while changing only the colour of the administrations. In South Africa, for example, elements of the anti-apartheid leadership accepted a negotiated settlement that delivered political rights while leaving economic apartheid largely intact, a compromise that betrayed the movement's original vision of full liberation. In the United States, following Reconstruction, certain Black leaders advocated accommodation with white supremacy rather than continued struggle for full equity and reparatory justice. From these examples, we can identify several patterns of betrayal. The individualization of collective struggle, where representatives accept personal advancement or recognition as a substitute for systemic change. The professionalization and bureaucratization of movement leadership, where advocates become dependent on institutional roles and salaries that incentivize compromise. The internalization of respectability politics, where leaders begin to view radical demands as unrealistic or irresponsible. The substitution of access for power, where proximity to decision makers is confused with actual decision-making authority. To address these patterns, our movements must develop clear criteria for authentic representation based on demonstrated commitment to African-centered principles, values, and accountability to our communities. Frameworks for naming and addressing betrayal that distinguish between strategic compromise and fundamental abandonment of principles. Collective leadership structures that prevent any individual from becoming indispensable to the movement. Spiritual and cultural resources that strengthen our moral courage, our sense of ethics in the face of co-optation pressures. By directly addressing the politics of betrayal, rather than avoiding this difficult topic, we strengthen our movement's resistance to divide and conquer tactics and ensure that our representatives remain accountable to the ancestral covenant that guides our work. Reclaiming reparations discourses from the reparations industrial complex. As we discussed in the first part of this episode, an emerging reparations industrial complex threatens to capture and neutralize transformative reparations work by separating discourse from action and allowing institutions to adopt our language without meaningful change. Reclaiming our discourse requires deliberate strategies. First, we must distinguish between reparations processes and reparations products. True reparations work involves ongoing processes of relationship transformation, structural change, and community rebuilding and healing, not merely the delivery of specific products or payments. When institutions reduce reparations to a deliverable product, whether monetary payments, apologies, or symbolic gestures, they detach the material dimension from the relational transformation that true repair requires. Second, we must maintain the connection between repair and power. Reparations is fundamentally about redistributing not just resources, but power, the ability to determine conditions and make decisions. When institutions offer resources while maintaining control over how those resources are used or distributed, they preserve the fundamental power imbalances that enabled harm in the first place. The University of Glasgow's reparative justice programme demonstrates this tension. While committing £20 million to research partnerships with the University of the West Indies, the programme maintains significant establishment academic control over research priorities and implementation, preserving established power relationships while appearing to share resources and be reparative. Thirdly, we must insist on the distinction between charity and reparations. Charity reinforces the power of the giver, who determines what to give and under what conditions, and in fact how much to give. Reparations acknowledges obligations and the right of those harmed to determine the nature of repair and the how and what of repair. Many institutional reparations programs operate within a charitable framework that preserves institutional control rather than transferring decision-making authority to affected communities and recognizing the requirement for a restitution of our people's resources amassed by the not-for-profit and other industrial complexes. Fourthly, we must reclaim the temporal dimensions of reparations discourse. True reparations addresses past, present, and future, connecting historical harms to ongoing injustices and establishing guarantees against future repetition. The reparations industrial complex often isolates historical harms from their contemporary and ongoing manifestations, treating repair as closing the book on past injustice rather than transforming current systems. Fifthly, we must reject the separation of material and spiritual dimensions of repair. African worldviews overstand these as interconnected. Material redistribution without spiritual recognition of harm and responsibility remains incomplete, while spiritual acknowledgement without material change becomes empty symbolism. To reclaim our discourse from the reparations industrial complex, we can develop and widely share community-centered definitions and standards of reparations that emphasize process, power, and interconnection, and can evaluate institutional reparations commitments, providing a tool for distinguishing between authentic and captured initiatives. We can also create frameworks for evaluating institutional commitments against these comprehensive standards. We can establish community-led certification processes that distinguish between authentic reparations work and performative gestures, and we can amplify examples of transformative reparations processes that have maintained their integrity. By reclaiming the discourse and narrative of reparations, we preserve its power to name both historical and ongoing harms of the Maangamizi and to demand transformative rather than simply reformist responses. As we conclude this exploration of movement protection, let us remember that strategies of capture and co-optation themselves reflect recognition of our movement's power. Institutions and governments do not attempt to capture movements they consider irrelevant or ineffective. The sophisticated efforts to redirect, dilute, or contain reparations demands represent acknowledgement of the transformative potential of our work. Our protection strategies, building independent infrastructure, employing practical tools for maintaining integrity, engaging strategically with international frameworks, addressing the politics of representation, and reclaiming our emancipatory, liberatory discourses all strengthen this transformative potential. They enable us to engage with powerful institutions without being absorbed by them or intimidated by them, to negotiate without abandoning our principles and values, and to build relationships without compromising our vision and future generations. So we in the Maangamizi Educational Trust invite listeners to examine the reparations initiatives in your own communities through these analytical lenses, identifying both vulnerabilities to capture and opportunities for protection. Initiate community conversations about what non-negotiable principles should guide your local reparations work. Develop accountability structures for those representing your community in reparations processes. Create political education campaigns and materials that build shared understanding of comprehensive repair, and connect with global networks that can provide solidarity and support when local pressures intensify. Reparations is a commitment to a restored and repaired community as family concept. This family conceptualization extends beyond individual benefits to collective liberation or co-liberation, beyond symbolic gestures to structural transformation, beyond historical accounting to contemporary flourishing and future guarantees of non-repetition. By protecting our movements from capture, we honour this family concept and advance the ancestral covenant that binds us to continue this sacred work. In our next show, we're going to provide some updates that have been happening in our movement for repair or reparations. And we're going to have a little surprise for you by changing up the show a little bit. Please do continue to keep us informed about what's happening. Let us know your thoughts about the discussions we're having so far. And also let us know about any topics that you think we should be covering. You can email us, maangamizitrust@gmail.com. Our exploration of current reparations developments is not mere reportage. It is part of the preparation. Preparation is the heartbeat of our liberation work. Each gathering, each strategy, each community initiative for repair represents a critical moment of readiness, of strategic positioning, of building the capacity to effect and secure comprehensive repair. So in our next show on Yɛresiesie Preparation for Reparations podcast, we'll dive more deeply into the cutting edge of our global reparations organising. mapping the latest movements, strategies, and transformative possibilities emerging across Africa and its global diaspora. Join us then as we connect the dots of our ongoing Pan-African reparations as liberation struggle. Until then, may we remain steadfast in our commitment to comprehensive repair. Thank you to Brother Daniel Kofi, our technical assistant, for all your support in recording this show.